"Get your hands off me!" The words slice through the quiet hum of a seemingly ordinary pharmacy, but this isn't an ordinary moment. A frail elderly woman, grandmother, devoted wife, lifelong public servant, is being yanked against the counter, her prescription scattered across the floor, her dignity hanging by a thread. Onlookers gasp, some record, some laugh, and one man in uniform believes he has the right to humiliate her, all because of the color of her skin. But what he doesn't know, what no one outside this small moment realizes yet, is that the woman he's trying to shame has spent decades wielding authority, justice, and wisdom. In the next few minutes, you will witness a story of courage that shatters assumptions, exposes systemic injustice, and flips the power dynamics in a way you won't soon forget. This is more than a single arrest. It's a window into a lifetime of inequality, a confrontation that will challenge your sense of right and wrong, and a lesson in dignity, resilience, and justice. By the end, you'll feel outrage, admiration, and hope all at once. Watch closely, share this story, and subscribe now, because every story like this brings us closer to a world where respect, fairness, and justice truly matter. The warm autumn light filtered softly through the large windows of the Greenview Pharmacy, casting long shadows over the polished tile floor. Margaret Allen, 72, moved carefully through the aisles, her cardigan brushing against the neatly stacked shelves of vitamins and over-the-counter remedies. The pharmacy was quiet for a Friday morning in Lakewood, New Jersey, a town known for its suburban calm and leafy streets. She had shopped here for years, her husband Harold's medications as familiar to the staff as the local news headlines. Today, however, the ordinary hum of daily life would be shattered in an instant, and Margaret, a retired federal judge, would find herself at the center of a storm she never asked for. Her hand hovered over the small orange bottle of lisinopril, the medication Harold depended on to keep his heart steady. She had promised him she would pick it up this morning before her weekly volunteer meeting at the local library. Harold, 76, had suffered a mild stroke 6 months prior, leaving his left side slightly weaker and his speech halting. He had insisted she attend to this errand herself, trusting her careful precision. Margaret had never let him down in 50 years of marriage. Every promise was sacred. Today she would keep that promise, even as fate cruelly set the stage for an unimaginable humiliation. As she approached the counter, she noticed Marcus Griffin, the pharmacy manager, smiling warmly as he arranged the daily prescriptions. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Harold's heart medication?" He reached for a small stack of pre-filled prescriptions, a routine exchange that had become almost ceremonial over the years. The young pharmacy technician, Emily Tran, peeked over from the pill counter, offering a polite nod. Margaret returned their greetings with the quiet dignity she had carried into courtrooms for decades. Outside, Officer Ryan Green parked his patrol car under a maple tree across the lot, his radio crackling softly as dispatch reported routine activity. He was 32, lean and eager, a young officer with just 5 years on the force, but a reputation for aggressiveness that preceded him. His supervisor had emphasized this pharmacy as a hotspot for prescription fraud. Green's mind had been primed with quotas, 3 arrests by the end of his shift, 2 down, 1 to go. He did not know who Margaret Allen was, nor did he consider that sometimes what appeared suspicious was simply ordinary life. He only saw opportunity. Margaret stepped toward the counter at exactly 10:15 a.m., 15 minutes before her scheduled pickup time. Her hands, though steady, bore the faint tremor of age, and her eyes, magnified by gold-rimmed glasses, scanned the label carefully. "Lisinopril, 10 mg," she muttered softly, almost inaudible over the quiet hum of refrigeration units and the soft whispers of other customers. To her, this was mundane. To Green, it was something else entirely. He pushed open the pharmacy door with a calculated stride, body camera blinking red, and entered the space like a predator crossing a threshold. Margaret's presence registered immediately. A small figure, elderly, black, absorbed in a prescription label. Green's instincts, trained to detect trafficking and resale, flared. In his 5 years, he had learned the hallmarks of someone up to something: careful scrutiny of labels, repeated glances at the pill count, a measured approach to picking up someone else's medication. None of this, of course, applied to Margaret Allen, but Green did not know that. He only saw the narrative he had been trained to enforce. "Excuse me, ma'am." Green's voice cut across the pharmacy like a whip. "I need to speak with you." Margaret looked up, startled. Her hands instinctively tightened around the bottle of lisinopril. "Yes, officer. What is the problem?" she asked, her tone polite but firm, carrying the calm authority of someone used to speaking in courtrooms filled with tension. "I need to know what you're doing with that medication," Green said, stepping closer, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. His eyes flicked to the other customers, who paused mid-step, sensing the shift from routine to confrontation. Marcus Griffin's expression shifted subtly, the practiced calm of a professional cracking under the pressure of an unexpected scenario. Emily froze, the small tablet in her hands momentarily forgotten. Margaret straightened, placing the prescription bottle on the counter as she looked him in the eye. "This is my husband's medication," she said, carefully enunciating each word. "Harold Allen, heart condition, daily dosage, fully documented with insurance and medical authorization. I have everything you could ask for." Her voice remained calm, steady, but the coldness in Green's eyes indicated he had no interest in her explanation. To him, she was another statistic, another quota to be met, and the evidence he demanded was irrelevant compared to the narrative he had been trained to follow. Green's face hardened, and he raised a hand toward the handcuffs at his belt. "Turn around and put your hands on the counter," he ordered, the weight of authority behind his tone. Margaret paused, recognizing the peril in the gesture. The quiet dignity she had cultivated over a lifetime braced her for the moment, but she would not comply blindly. Her spine straightened, her eyes meeting his with the unyielding gaze of a woman who had presided over federal courtrooms for decades. "Officer, I am conducting a legitimate errand. I am following the law. I ask that you reconsider your actions." Green sneered. "Don't play dumb with me. Hands on the counter now." He moved closer, the tension palpable. Other customers shifted nervously. Some fumbled for their phones to record what they sensed was a spectacle, while others froze, unsure how to respond. The pharmacy became a stage, Margaret the unwilling actress in a drama she had never auditioned for. Her hands remained at her sides, the orange bottle of lisinopril between them, a lifeline to a husband who depended on her for his survival. Marcus cleared his throat. "Officer, she's a regular customer. This is routine. She comes in every month, same prescriptions, same insurance. There's no issue here." Green ignored him, his mind focused on the checklist in his head. Suspicious behavior, possible diversion, quota fulfillment. Margaret could feel the pressure mounting, not just from Green but from the quiet weight of injustice settling over the room. At 72, she had endured many indignities, but this was different. This was public, humiliating, and aggressive. Green's hand closed around the cuff, metal catching the fluorescent light. Margaret's pulse quickened, but she did not panic. The physical pain was secondary to the indignity, and she had learned long ago that control over one's mind was more powerful than control over one's body. She felt the first touch of cold metal against her wrists, and a wave of anger, frustration, and sorrow flooded her. She thought of Harold, alone at home, waiting for this medication, trusting her to keep him safe. Her resolve hardened. She would not submit silently, not today. "Officer, you are making a serious mistake," she said, her voice calm but carrying the full weight of decades of authority and life experience. Green laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "The only mistake here is yours. I suggest you comply." He snapped the handcuffs around her wrist with deliberate force, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot through the pharmacy. Pills scattered across the linoleum, rolling into corners, small capsules of life and health, now a chaotic symbol of the injustice unfolding. Margaret's knees stiffened, her joints protesting with age, but her gaze remained fixed on Green. She would not cry out. She would not give him satisfaction. Her hands, though bound, were steady. She could feel the eyes of the witnesses on her, some horrified, others quietly recording. Emily Tran's hands shook as she reached for the phone. Marcus Griffin's lips pressed into a thin line. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, fear, and tension. Green's grip on her shoulder was firm, almost theatrical, as he began guiding her toward the exit. Margaret's steps were slow but deliberate, each one a silent assertion of dignity and strength. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint scent of fallen leaves. Passers-by stopped, their eyes widening at the surreal scene. An elderly black woman handcuffed, escorted by a young officer, her prescription spilling across the pharmacy floor. Margaret's voice, low and unwavering, cut through the chaos. "I am not your suspect. I am not your target. I am a retired federal judge." Green paused, startled, but did not release his hold. The words hung in the air, impossible, improbable, a twist of fate that neither he nor the witnesses could fully comprehend yet. Margaret's calm, deliberate revelation created an invisible tension that rippled through every person present, a silent promise that the story would not end here, that justice had its own trajectory. Her reading glasses, one lens slightly cracked from the spin Green forced, caught the sunlight, glinting like a signal to the world. Dignity could not be handcuffed. Truth could not be silenced. And authority was not defined by badges alone. In that moment, Margaret Allen embodied every battle fought for fairness, integrity, and humanity, standing against a system eager to assert power over the vulnerable. The scene froze in the minds of every witness. The scattered pills, the strained officer, the unbroken poise of a 72-year-old woman who had spent her life defending others against injustice. The cameras in pockets captured it all, the images spreading instantly across social media, each click amplifying the outrage, the empathy, the shared sense of moral collapse. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a reckoning, a sudden, undeniable spotlight on the consequences of unchecked authority and the courage of one woman who refused to yield. And as Margaret was guided into the patrol car, the sound of the closing door reverberated like a bell tolling, signaling the start of a battle that would extend far beyond the pharmacy walls. A fight that would test not only the young officer's assumptions, but the very notion of accountability, justice, and human dignity. The patrol car smelled of stale vinyl, disinfectant, and the faint musk of fear. Margaret Allen sat upright in the back seat, wrists on still bound, her breathing steady despite the ache running through her shoulders and elbows. Outside, the hum of traffic and the distant shouts of bystanders underscored the surrealness of the moment. Officer Ryan Green, 32, leaned against the steering wheel, adjusting his radio and muttering quietly to himself about reports, quotas, and procedural accuracy. He believed he had executed the perfect arrest, one that would satisfy his supervisor and pad his numbers. Yet an unspoken tension began gnawing at the edges of his confidence. Margaret Allen's mind was elsewhere. Every pulse of her husband's heart, every echo of the pharmacy floor, the scattered pills, the indignity of force, each memory sharpened her resolve. 52 years of life experience and 23 years on the federal bench had trained her to read not only human behavior, but also the power structures that enabled it. She observed Green's posture, the slight tremor in his fingers as he fumbled with his cuff keys, the subtle tightening of his jaw. The arrogance that had carried him into the pharmacy now wavered under the quiet authority radiating from her. "You think you've done your job," she said softly, her voice breaking through the hum of the idling engine. "But you have no idea who you've touched." Green's head snapped toward her, surprise flickering in his eyes. Her calmness was unsettling, almost unnatural for someone in his perceived position of control. I just followed the procedure," Green stammered, his eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the confined space of the car. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, attempting to ground himself, but the confident rhythm he had rehearsed in his mind faltered. Margaret's gaze never wavered, unwavering in its precision, a mirror reflecting every flaw in his assumptions. "I am a retired federal judge," she continued, the words deliberate, measured, yet carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate in the air of the car. The simple statement cracked the veneer of Green's composure. His fingers, still tense around the keys, faltered. The word judge hung in the air, and with it, the realization that his actions had crossed a threshold far beyond ordinary misconduct. "You're lying," Green said, though his voice lacked conviction. Something in Margaret's posture, the unshakable calm, The steady rhythm of her breathing suggested otherwise. I've spent 23 years presiding over federal criminal law cases, civil rights enforcement, law enforcement misconduct. I know your type. I've seen officers like you before. I've sentenced them. And you? You've just made yourself my next lesson. The words cut through him like a scalpel. Green's stomach twisted. The confidence he had carried in his authority, the justification he had constructed to validate his impatience and aggression, collapsed under the weight of her declaration. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the car's terminal, fingers fumbling with the keyboard. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible. A federal judge, arrested in handcuffs for picking up her husband's heart medication? His mind struggled to reconcile the scenario with everything he had been taught about authority, obedience, and control. "Run my name through your system," Margaret said quietly. "I am Margaret Allen, Federal Judicial Database. You will find my commission papers, my security clearance, and my retirement documents. You'll see exactly who I am." The clarity in her voice left no room for misinterpretation. Green's fingers hovered above the keyboard, trembling as he typed each letter with painstaking care, knowing the weight of the consequences that might follow. The screen is populated with records. Appointment dates, judicial confirmations, case files, security clearances, all tangible proof of a life dedicated to law, ethics, and justice. Green's eyes scanned the information, disbelief giving way to horror. Margaret Allen, confirmed by the U.S. Senate. 23 years on the bench, hundreds of criminal cases adjudicated, specializing in law enforcement oversight. The young officer's world, carefully constructed to justify his actions, had crumbled in a single, undeniable revelation. Margaret watched him carefully, the faintest edge of satisfaction in her expression. She was not vindictive. She did not relish the humiliation that would inevitably cascade over him. Yet the moment required acknowledgement. The predator had been revealed, and his perceived power evaporated. Green, who had believed himself untouchable, pale and rigid in the driver's seat, now confronted the human consequence of his assumptions, his prejudice, and his unquestioned enforcement of quotas. You're a judge," Green muttered, voice barely audible. The word sounded like a confession, though it was merely an echo of realization. Margaret Allen remained seated, composed, the back of her hand lightly brushing the orange prescription bottle, a symbol of the ordinary life he had so ruthlessly disrupted. She allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the revelation sink fully. The silence was a weapon, piercing the nervous hum of the idling patrol car, demanding reflection. "I've spent decades ensuring the law protects citizens, not terrorizes them," Margaret said. Her tone was calm, yet every word carried authority that Green could feel pressing into the back of his mind. "I've sentenced officers who abused their power, who exploited the vulnerable, who thought the uniform gave them license to inflict humiliation. And you've just added yourself to that list." Green's hand trembled as he reached for the car radio. Dispatch chatter filled the cabin with background noise, but each word sounded distant, irrelevant. The narrative he had built for months, even years, about quotas, performance, and policing without consequence, was irrelevant in the presence of a life shaped by decades of moral clarity. Margaret's eyes, steady and unwavering, tracked every twitch, every hesitation, and every faltering attempt at justification. She knew how to read a man like him. Every instinct he had relied on to dominate the situation now betrayed him. Margaret's voice softened slightly, but it carried the weight of inevitability. "You have roughly 30 seconds to consider the consequences of what you've done. You have assaulted me, detained me, and humiliated me, all without cause. Do you understand what this means? This isn't about paperwork, statistics, or arrests. This is about accountability." Green swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear invading his mouth. His body betrayed him, tremors in his hands, a racing pulse, sweat beating along his temples, signals he could not ignore. He tried to speak, to offer a justification, but no words came. Margaret had dismantled every defensive posture, leaving only the stark reality of his misconduct. Her eyes, filled with a combination of sorrow and controlled fury, locked onto his, compelling him to reckon with the truth he had ignored for too long. He felt it in the pit of his stomach. The entire structure of his professional existence, constructed around dominance and fear, was now teetering on the edge. Margaret continued, her voice soft but authoritative. "Do you know what I've seen, Officer Green? I've seen the lives ruined by officers who thought they were above the law. I've seen communities devastated by unchecked power. I've seen vulnerable people, especially the elderly and the marginalized, crushed under the weight of assumptions and quotas. Today, you chose to perpetuate that pattern. And now the world will see exactly what you've done." The patrol car's atmosphere grew heavier. Every breath Green drew felt like an accusation. Every tick of the dashboard clock a countdown to inevitable reckoning. Margaret's calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos that had defined his perspective. He was caught between the procedural certainty he relied on and the human consequence of his actions. Margaret leaned slightly forward, her posture composed despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists. "Do you realize how many people are watching?" she asked, her voice carrying a soft, yet unmistakable command. Green's eyes widened. Outside, the scattered witnesses at the pharmacy, phones raised, had already begun documenting the event, sending ripples through social media. The hum of cellular networks, the notifications, the incoming calls, all compounded the weight of exposure. Margaret's calculated words gave life to the moral gravity Green had ignored. What happens in public spaces does not remain private, especially when injustice is enacted before witnesses. "I suggest you think carefully," she continued, "about the implications of your actions. This isn't simply a personal embarrassment. This is legal, professional, and public accountability. Every act of misconduct has consequences." Green's lips parted as if to respond, but the words died in his throat. Margaret's presence, authority, and unshakable confidence were suffocating any defense he had left. She had turned the tables in a manner that no one in the back of that patrol car could ignore. Her voice softened further, threading through the car with a quiet but unyielding power. "And understand this, Officer Green. This is only the beginning. I will not stop at holding you accountable personally. The system that allowed you to believe this behavior was acceptable, it will be exposed." Green's hand shook as he reached once more for the terminal, attempting to pull up her records. Each keystroke felt heavier, slower, weighted with the knowledge that the story unfolding in that small patrol car would travel far beyond Lakewood, beyond New Jersey, beyond him. The car was a crucible. Green, 32, trained, uniformed, and ostensibly in control, was reduced to a man confronting a lifetime of privilege, colliding with moral authority. Margaret Allen, 72, confined, vulnerable in appearance, yet unassailable in reality, held the balance. Every muscle in her body radiated quiet strength. Every gesture, measured and precise, conveyed decades of experience reading human behavior, institutional power, and the ways to bend them without breaking one's own moral spine. "You will learn," she said, her tone almost conversational, "that authority does not equate to justice. That power, untempered by reason and morality, can be exposed. That cruelty, no matter how small it seems in the moment, leaves a trail." Green's eyes met hers through the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he felt the weight of exposure. Not from a supervisor, not from procedure, but from a lifetime of ethical certainty embodied in a single human being. Margaret's words, measured and deliberate, echoed in his mind as he sat frozen, a man caught between ego and accountability, between fear and the undeniable moral imperative imposed by her presence. Outside, the world had already begun to witness, recording every micro-expression, every subtle gesture, every whispered word that would soon become evidence of misconduct and eventually a catalyst for systemic accountability. By Wednesday morning, Margaret Allen's arrest had already rippled far beyond the quiet streets of Lakewood. The video captured by several onlookers at the pharmacy had been uploaded, shared, and dissected across social media platforms, drawing both outrage and disbelief. The clip, 30 seconds of sheer injustice, showed a 72-year-old woman being manhandled for nothing more than collecting her husband's life-sustaining medication. Comments poured in, horror, anger, empathy, and fury. People could see the raw unfairness, The betrayal of the badge, the humiliation, the systemic cruelty. But they had no idea yet the full depth of what had transpired. Sarah Collins, an investigative reporter for the Lakewood Chronicle, was among the first to pick up the story. She had spent over a decade covering police misconduct and civil rights violations, and yet, as she scrolled through the shaky footage of Margaret's handcuffs and the clattering pills, even she felt her stomach twist. It was an image of power abused, the type she had encountered countless times, yet never with this magnitude of visceral public exposure. She could see Margaret's composure in the back of the patrol car, her calm eyes locked on Green, unbroken even as every witness and camera bore down on her. Sarah's investigative instincts kicked in immediately. She began constructing a timeline, pulling together witness accounts, timestamps, and social media uploads. By mid-morning, she had contacted Marcus Nguyen, the CVS pharmacy manager, whose hands shook slightly as he described what he had seen. He explained that Margaret had entered the pharmacy at 2:15 p.m., long before Green had arrived, and had spent a routine 3 minutes retrieving her husband's heart medication, speaking calmly, presenting insurance, and demonstrating all proper procedures. Green's arrival at 2:28 p.m. marked the beginning of the unnecessary confrontation. "She's been coming here for years," Marcus emphasized, his voice cracking slightly over the phone. "I know her. She's always polite, always prepared. This was nothing." Sarah typed furiously, documenting each detail. The narrative emerging from the footage and testimony was already starkly different from the one Green would inevitably submit in his arrest report. Here was a woman conducting a legal routine errand. Here was an officer performing an abuse of authority in broad daylight. Sarah's next call was to the Lakewood Police Department's Public Information Office. As expected, the response was defensive. "Officer Green followed protocol," the spokesperson said curtly. "We cannot comment on ongoing investigations." The phrasing betrayed what Sarah already suspected: bureaucratic shielding, damage control, and an attempt to minimize exposure. Pending investigation, procedural compliance, suspicious behavior. These were euphemisms carefully constructed to protect one officer while eroding public trust. Determined to dig deeper, Sarah filed a formal records request for Green's personnel file, knowing that what came back would be redacted, delayed, and incomplete. She could anticipate the omissions, the sanitized version of his career, the official blindness to misconduct. But even fragmented records could illuminate a pattern. By late afternoon, she received a tip from an unexpected source: Dr. Elaine Parker, Margaret's physician, who had been monitoring her husband's condition. Dr. Parker confirmed Margaret's authority to pick up her husband's prescriptions, her power of attorney, and her adherence to all legal procedures. This wasn't a matter of clerical confusion or miscommunication. Margaret Allen was entirely within her rights, making Green's actions not only aggressive, but flagrantly unlawful. Sarah's investigation began to take shape, a mosaic of deliberate misconduct, quota-driven arrests, and institutional negligence. She uncovered that Green had led District 3 in arrests of elderly defendants, a demographic statistically less likely to resist or challenge police authority. Data from previous months showed a pattern. Minor infractions, prescriptions, small-scale errors, or paperwork discrepancies escalated into full-blown arrests. Elderly individuals and minority residents were disproportionately targeted. Margaret's case wasn't an anomaly. It was the latest manifestation of a long-standing pattern of exploitation. By Thursday, Sarah's reporting had reached a critical stage. She obtained a copy of internal police communications, leaked by an officer within the department, frustrated with repeated abuses. Text messages from Green revealed the cold, calculated nature of his decisions. Target acquired at CVS, elderly black female, time for arrest. Number 3, one read, she won't even know what hit her. Metadata analysis confirmed the timing coincided with Margaret's routine errand. The messages showed a deliberate, premeditated operation to inflate arrest statistics, exploiting the vulnerable. Margaret Allen wasn't merely the victim of a momentary misjudgment. She had been targeted, chosen for maximum humiliation. The evidence extended further. Internal memos from Captain Leonard Morris, Green's direct supervisor, contained language focused on performance metrics. Arrest numbers need improvement. District 3 behind target. The memos emphasized quota fulfillment over community safety or justice. Officers were evaluated not on the reduction of crime, but on the volume of arrests. This explained Green's reckless prioritization of optics over ethics, the deliberate escalation of a routine pharmacy visit into a public spectacle of coercion. Sarah compiled her report with painstaking attention to detail. By Thursday evening, the Chronicle had published a preliminary exposé outlining the arrest, the quota-driven misconduct, and the systemic failures of the Lakewood Police Department. Social media erupted in response. Clips from multiple angles circulated widely, revealing Green's unprovoked aggression and Margaret's dignity in the face of brutality. Public sentiment surged: outrage, disbelief, empathy, and a growing demand for accountability. Margaret Allen watched the unfolding coverage from her husband's bedside, Harold asleep beside her, the monitors gently beeping in rhythm with his recovering heart. She had anticipated resistance from the department, the legal bureaucracy, and the public, but nothing could diminish her resolve. For the first time since Tuesday, she allowed herself a fleeting sense of validation. The truth, painstakingly documented and witnessed, was beginning to shine through layers of systemic protectionism and prejudice. The following morning brought a new ally. Judge Patricia Wilson, a former colleague from the federal courthouse. She arrived at Margaret's home carrying stacks of documentation, letters of support, and legal precedents. Margaret barely lifted her eyes from Harold's medication schedule as Patricia spoke, her voice firm yet compassionate. "What they've done to you is unconscionable. We're mobilizing support. Federal judges from our district, pro bono legal teams, and civil rights advocates are all standing with you." Margaret allowed herself a faint nod. The isolation she had felt in the immediate aftermath of the arrest was beginning to dissipate, replaced by solidarity and determination. Patricia's presence catalyzed further action. Together, they coordinated a multi-pronged strategy: public advocacy, legal filings, and the collection of documentation. Margaret's colleagues provided written attestations of her unwavering ethical standards, her meticulous attention to due process, and her decades-long record of fair, impartial judgment. They emphasized her history of overseeing law enforcement misconduct cases, underscoring the profound irony and injustice of her treatment by Green. By Friday, the narrative had grown far beyond a local incident. Major news outlets, including national television networks, picked up the story, highlighting the systematic abuse inherent in quota-driven policing. Every detail, from the scattered pills on the pharmacy floor to the body camera footage showing Green's deliberate obstruction, fed a growing public awareness. Comment sections filled with personal testimonies, citizens recounting their own encounters with unjust policing, expressing solidarity with Margaret Allen, and demanding systemic reform. The cumulative weight of exposure began to impact the Lakewood Police Department internally. Captain Morris convened an emergency meeting with department lawyers, union representatives, and public relations staff. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the faint smell of stale coffee mixing with palpable anxiety. Screens displayed viral social media posts, commentary threads, and internal memos, all highlighting the potential damage to the department's credibility. Morris instructed that Green be placed on administrative leave, a thinly veiled attempt at damage control rather than genuine accountability. Even as the department attempted to contain the scandal, Margaret and her allies pressed forward. Legal filings documented the arrest's impropriety, highlighting both procedural violations and the egregious abuse of authority. Every witness statement, social media post, and surveillance recording was meticulously cross-referenced. The compilation was overwhelming in its clarity. Green had not acted in the interest of justice, public safety, or community service. He had acted as a predator, exploiting his uniform in the compliance of perceived vulnerability. Harold's recovery remained a delicate concern. Margaret balanced her desire for justice with the need to protect him from further stress. Every phone call, media inquiry, and strategy meeting was tempered by her awareness of his fragile condition. Yet the threat of inertia or silence, the continuation of systemic abuse without intervention, was unacceptable. She could not allow fear or compassion to paralyze her. The stakes were too high, the precedent too important. By Sunday evening, 7 other victims of Green's misconduct had come forward, emboldened by the exposure of Margaret's case. Elderly individuals, minority community members, and vulnerable defendants, all previously silenced by fear or intimidation, provided accounts of harassment, unlawful detainment, and racial profiling. The pattern was undeniable, the systemic failures corroborated. Margaret's arrest was no isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a deeply ingrained culture that tolerated, enabled, and rewarded abuse. Monday brought national attention. Congressional representatives from New Jersey demanded federal oversight of Lakewood's police practices. Advocacy groups amplified the story, calling for reforms, accountability, and systemic change. Margaret Allen, seated beside Harold in the hospital room, felt a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The stress of the past week had taxed both body and mind, yet the swell of support reminded her that the struggle was worth enduring. Her fight was no longer solitary, it had become a movement. By Tuesday, further evidence emerged from an encrypted source within the department. Audio recordings captured Green and his partner, Officer Daniel Rodriguez, coordinating the arrest. Every word reinforced the premeditated nature of their actions, targeting Margaret specifically because she was elderly, Black, and presumed compliant. "Target acquired," Green said. "She won't even know what hit her." Rodriguez acknowledged the instructions, affirming a strategy designed to generate arrest statistics rather than serve public safety. The evidence was incontrovertible, revealing an intentional, coordinated effort to manipulate outcomes for departmental gain. By midweek, the full magnitude of Margaret Allen's arrest had reverberated through Lakewood's corridors of power. The social media footage had gone viral, sparking widespread condemnation and calls for justice. Yet inside the Lakewood Police Department, the reaction was markedly different. For Captain Leonard Morris, Green's direct supervisor, the priority was containment, control, and survival. He had convened an emergency meeting with department lawyers, union representatives, and public relations staff. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee, mixed with palpable tension and the unspoken dread that the city's most visible scandal in decades was spiraling beyond their control. The legal team opened the meeting with a review of the social media posts. Screens displayed shaky smartphone footage from multiple angles. Margaret's hands cuffed behind her back, the pills scattered across the pharmacy floor, her calm yet firm gaze as Green barked orders. The attorneys muttered under their breath, calculating potential liabilities. A discussion began, not about ethics, not about rectifying abuse, but about narrative management, damage control, public perception, statistical projections of lawsuits and settlements. Morris's jaw tightened as the collective concern turned to how the story might affect the department's budget, pensions, and public reputation. Yet outside the sterile conference room, Margaret Allen was anything but passive. Seated beside her husband Harold in their Lakewood apartment, she meticulously reviewed the unfolding reports and calls from allies. Judge Patricia Wilson, a former colleague, had arrived the previous afternoon with a briefcase of documentation, letters of support from federal judges, and legal analysis. "They underestimated you," Patricia said firmly, her voice carrying the authority that once commanded federal courtrooms. Margaret nodded, a flicker of determination cutting through the fatigue etched into her face. She could feel Harold's hand, fragile but warm, clasp hers in quiet solidarity. Every beat of his heart reminded her of what she was fighting for, not just justice for herself, but the integrity of the system and the protection of those who lacked her resources, her experience, or her voice. Margaret and Patricia immediately began coordinating a multi-pronged legal and advocacy strategy. Their first step was to formalize the evidence: videos, witness statements, internal memos, text messages, and body camera footage. Every piece was meticulously cross-referenced. Margaret's calm demeanor during the arrest, the scattering of pills across the pharmacy floor, and Green's repeated aggressive actions were documented in detail. The pattern of predation became unmistakable. Green's arrest was not an isolated incident. He had spent years targeting elderly and minority citizens, using his uniform to intimidate and humiliate. The video evidence now formed a foundation for a federal civil rights case that could not be ignored. By Thursday morning, the cumulative evidence had been compiled into a preliminary dossier. It was extensive, hundreds of pages detailing Green's conduct, the systemic failures of District 3, and the department's complicity in quota-driven arrests. Sarah Collins, who had been tracking the story since the first viral clip, added context with investigative reporting, including past incidents involving Green. The pattern was undeniable. Elderly defendants, minor infractions, and minorities disproportionately targeted. Internal complaints had either been dismissed or buried. Internal affairs investigations frequently concluded insufficient evidence, often due to malfunctioning body cameras or missing documentation. Margaret's arrest now had the weight of decades of corroborated misconduct behind it. At the same time, Harold's health remained a delicate concern. Margaret balanced the urgency of public exposure with the need to protect him from additional stress. Each call, media interview, and strategy meeting was tempered by her awareness of his vulnerability. She recognized the risk that prolonged confrontation could exacerbate Harold's cardiovascular fragility. Yet inaction was not an option. She would not allow fear to paralyze her. The stakes were too high. Her husband's life, the dignity of the elderly, and the principle of accountability were intertwined. By Friday morning, the story had captured the attention of national media. CNN, The Washington Post, and NBC News began reporting on the arrest, highlighting the egregious abuse of authority and the clear racial undertones of Green's actions. The narrative was compelling. A 72-year-old federal judge, handcuffed while collecting her husband's prescription, her dignity publicly assaulted in a pharmacy, all for an officer's quota. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Social media channels overflowed with support, anger, and disbelief. Citizens expressed outrage at the systemic abuse of power and demanded immediate accountability. Simultaneously, former victims of Green's misconduct began coming forward. By Sunday evening, Margaret had been contacted by 7 individuals who had endured harassment, racial profiling, and unlawful arrests at Green's hands over the past decade. Each account added weight to the case, illustrating the systematic nature of his behavior. Elderly individuals, minority community members, and vulnerable defendants, all previously silenced by fear, shared details of intimidation, verbal abuse, and unwarranted detainment. Margaret's case became emblematic, a rallying point for exposing entrenched departmental misconduct. On Monday, the mayor's office publicly supported the Lakewood Police Department, framing the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding. The police union held a rally backing Green, while city council members issued statements praising the department's commitment to public safety. Margaret realized that she was now confronting not just a single officer, but an entrenched system prepared to defend its own at any cost. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension was palpable. Harold, though gradually recovering, experienced elevated stress and anxiety with each update. Margaret held his hand, drawing strength from their decades together, yet aware that each breath was precious. Tuesday brought a critical development. Sarah Collins received an encrypted email from an anonymous whistleblower within the department. The message contained a body camera audio file from Officer Daniel Rodriguez, Green's partner on the day of the arrest. Though his camera had supposedly been inactive, the recording revealed explicit coordination between the 2 officers. Green's words were chilling. Target acquired, elderly black female. Perfect stats padding. Rodriguez confirmed, copy. Perimeter maintained, civilians back. Remember, accidental camera malfunction if things get messy. The evidence was damning. The arrest had been planned, strategic, and premeditated. A cold exercise in intimidation, with no legal justification. Margaret's pulse quickened as she listened to the recording. Every word reinforced the narrative of deliberate humiliation. The plan was clear. Create arrests to satisfy quotas, target the powerless, and protect the perpetrators through bureaucratic shields. Green's actions were neither random nor reactionary. They were part of a systematic exploitation of authority. The scope of corruption and misconduct now extends far beyond a single incident. Margaret recognized the legal and ethical implications immediately. This was not simply a civil rights violation. It was a criminal conspiracy under federal statutes. By Wednesday morning, FBI agents had been alerted. Digital forensics confirmed the authenticity of the body camera audio. Internal analysis revealed that Green and Rodriguez had coordinated similar arrests over the past 18 months, targeting 67 elderly defendants and 43 prescription-related offenses. Statistical manipulation, intentional documentation gaps, and coordinated obstruction were clear. The implications were staggering. Multiple officers, acting with tacit supervisory approval, had exploited vulnerable populations to meet quotas. Margaret's singular ordeal had exposed a pattern of abuse that demanded federal intervention. Thursday brought a public reckoning. APD announced the suspension of Rodriguez and Green's termination for conduct unbecoming of a police officer. While the announcement did not mention federal investigation or criminal charges, the message was clear. The department was severing ties with those responsible. Yet for Margaret, this was only the beginning. Individual justice had been served, but the broader systemic accountability, the reform needed to prevent future abuse, was the true goal. By Thursday evening, an emergency city council session convened in Lakewood's municipal building. Every seat was filled. Cameras from local and national outlets lined the back wall. Margaret, steady and resolute, entered the chamber with Harold at her side, each step deliberate despite the toll of stress and fatigue. Their presence was a statement. They would not be intimidated, silenced, or disregarded. Council Chair Amanda Foster called the session to order. Green sat at the defendant's table, pale and withdrawn, his previous swagger replaced by the awareness that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. Sarah Collins and legal counsel presented the evidence to the council. The video footage, body camera audio, witness statements, and internal department communications. Every member of the council leaned forward as Green's own words echoed through the chamber. Target acquired, elderly black female. Perfect stats padding. She won't even know what hit her. The clarity of the recording left no room for ambiguity. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Members of the public, including those who had witnessed the arrest firsthand, nodded in recognition. The truth could no longer be denied. Margaret Allen rose to speak. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of decades of judicial authority. "You did not see a suspicious person on Tuesday afternoon," she said, addressing Green directly. "You saw an opportunity to abuse power without consequences. You saw someone you presumed powerless, and you sought to assert dominance. Power does not reside in badges or handcuffs. It resides in truth, accountability, and justice. For 23 years, I have adjudicated cases with fairness and integrity. Today, I stand for every citizen you have abused. Your actions were deliberate. Your complicity will not be tolerated." The chamber erupted in a mixture of applause and stunned silence. Green's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, attempting to salvage the situation, but the words fell flat. Margaret's unwavering presence and meticulous presentation of evidence left no space for defense. The council voted unanimously to support federal oversight and initiate further investigation into the systemic practices of the Lakewood Police Department. By the session's end, Green resigned under the weight of overwhelming evidence and public scrutiny. Margaret remained standing, her composure intact, even as cheers and camera flashes illuminated the room. Her victory was not merely personal, it was emblematic of accountability, systemic reform, and the resilience of those who refused to be silenced. The day after the city council session, Margaret Allen returned to her apartment with Harold at her side. The sunlight fell gently across their living room, yet the warmth was tempered by the memory of the week's chaos. The scattered pills, the harsh metal of the handcuffs, Green's cruel smirk, all of it lingered in her mind. She held Harold's hand tightly, noticing how frail he still appeared, how much stress had burdened his body. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. The fear, the humiliation, the injustice inflicted on a 72-year-old woman who had only wanted to protect her husband's health. Yet amidst the pain, there was an unmistakable spark of relief and triumph. Green was gone from the police department. His resignation, paired with a federal investigation into his misconduct and systemic abuses, meant that other officers like him could no longer operate unchecked. Justice had been served, not in whispers behind closed doors, but in the light of public scrutiny, backed by the authority of federal oversight and the unwavering courage of those who refused to be intimidated. Margaret's phone rang constantly that morning. Retired attorneys, law school classmates, former defendants, and concerned citizens called to offer support, legal advice, and encouragement. She listened to each voice with quiet gratitude, feeling a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold indifference she had endured at the hands of the police. Each call was a reminder that she was no longer isolated, that her fight had sparked solidarity, and that her story resonated far beyond the walls of Lakewood. For the first time since Tuesday, Margaret allowed herself to breathe, to feel the relief of justice beginning to take shape. Meanwhile, Harold's health slowly stabilized. His medications were back on schedule, and the stress that had spiked his blood pressure began to subside. The gentle rhythm of his heartbeat and the clarity returning to his speech were small but profound victories. Margaret had faced an impossible choice: protect her husband or pursue justice. She had refused to compromise, and the rewards, though still fragile, were beginning to manifest. Every day of recovery was a testament to resilience, love, and the power of standing firm against oppression. The legal team, now fully mobilized, worked to solidify the case against Green and expose the systemic failings of District 3. Sarah Collins coordinated with federal investigators, providing exhaustive documentation, videos, body camera recordings, whistleblower testimonies, internal memos, and a detailed timeline of events. The investigation revealed the depth of the department's manipulation, with arrest quotas, selective targeting of elderly and minority citizens, and repeated internal cover-ups. Green's actions had been a symptom of a larger problem, a system designed to protect officers at the expense of community trust and individual dignity. Across Lakewood, citizens rallied in support of Margaret and the principle of accountability. Community groups organized public forums, educational sessions, and advocacy campaigns. Residents shared their own experiences with police misconduct, many citing Green as a direct or indirect cause of suffering. The collective outrage and mobilization demonstrated the power of a single, brave individual to inspire systemic awareness and change. Margaret's ordeal had become a catalyst, transforming personal indignation into communal empowerment. By Friday, the national media had amplified the story. News segments highlighted the injustice, the courage of an elderly federal judge standing up to misconduct, and the broader implications for law enforcement practices nationwide. Headlines praised Margaret's resolve, the meticulous investigation by Sarah Collins, and the emergence of whistleblowers who refused to remain silent. Public opinion shifted decisively, framing the narrative around accountability, dignity, and the enduring power of justice. Green, once an unchallenged enforcer of quotas, became a cautionary tale of hubris, racism, and abuse of authority. Simultaneously, federal oversight began implementing systemic reforms within the Lakewood Police Department. Arrest quotas were eliminated, supervisors were required to approve prescription-related arrests, and officers underwent comprehensive retraining emphasizing ethics, racial equity, and de-escalation techniques. Internal investigations were overhauled to ensure impartiality and transparency, with independent civilian oversight boards empowered to review complaints. Margaret's fight had not only corrected her personal injustice, but had reshaped the structure and culture of an entire law enforcement institution. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret returned to the CVS pharmacy on Main Street. The familiar setting had changed subtly yet significantly. Marcus Thompson, the pharmacy manager, greeted her warmly, no trace of suspicion or doubt lingering in his eyes. The staff treated her with respect and courtesy, acknowledging her as a valued community member rather than a target for scrutiny. Margaret felt a profound sense of relief, a restoration of dignity in a space that had once been the scene of public humiliation. The ordinary act of collecting her husband's medication became an affirmation of regained agency and societal validation. In the wake of Green's termination in the federal investigation, multiple victims came forward to claim accountability. Settlements were issued ranging from $50,000 to $200,000, providing tangible restitution for the emotional and psychological harm endured. These payments symbolized recognition, acknowledgement, and a measure of justice for those who had been systematically oppressed. For Margaret, these outcomes were deeply personal, yet universally significant. They represented the possibility of redress for those who had long been marginalized in silence. Harold's recovery progressed steadily, With reduced stress and renewed confidence in his care, his speech improved, his smile returned, and his hands steadied. The serenity that Margaret had fought to preserve was slowly restored. Each day without fear or harassment reinforced the principle that justice, when pursued with courage and integrity, could restore balance to individual lives. Margaret and Harold's shared resilience became a living testament to the interdependence of personal dignity, familial love, and social justice. The broader societal impact was equally significant. The story of Margaret Allen inspired reforms beyond Lakewood, prompting other cities to re-examine police practices, implement oversight mechanisms, and reconsider the ethics of arrest quotas. Legal scholars referenced the case in academic journals, law schools incorporated the story into ethics curricula, and advocacy groups highlighted it as a landmark instance of systemic accountability catalyzed by individual courage. Margaret's personal experience had become a touchstone for education, awareness, and reform. Margaret's influence extended beyond legal and structural changes. Her courage and unwavering resolve became a source of emotional inspiration for countless individuals facing oppression, discrimination, or abuse of power. She embodied the principle that no one, regardless of age, race, or status, should be forced into silence or submission. Every call of support, every acknowledgement from former victims, every public gesture of solidarity reinforced the transformative power of moral and ethical fortitude. By mid-year, Lakewood had implemented permanent measures to prevent recurrence: mandatory diversity and sensitivity training, strict protocols for verifying legal authority before detaining any individual, and independent review boards empowered to investigate officer misconduct. These systemic reforms were tangible, lasting markers of Margaret's influence and resilience. They transformed institutional culture, created mechanisms for accountability, and ensured that no other citizen would endure the humiliation she had suffered without recourse. Margaret's final triumph was deeply personal, yet universally resonant. At home, she and Harold celebrated a quiet victory, sharing a simple breakfast together, the rhythm of normal life restored. The sunlight fell across their kitchen table, illuminating their intertwined hands, the remaining prescription bottles carefully organized, and the small notes of encouragement from friends, colleagues, and supporters. In that moment, Margaret felt the culmination of years of experience, patience, and perseverance, converging into a profound realization. Dignity had been preserved, truth had been asserted, and justice, though delayed, had not been denied. She reflected on the journey, the initial shock of public humiliation, the cascading realization of systemic corruption, the painstaking collection of evidence, the coordination with allies, the courage to confront entrenched power. Each moment had been painful, yet each had contributed to a transformative arc. Margaret's personal ordeal had catalyzed societal awareness, legislative consideration, and structural reform. Her pain had become the impetus for widespread change, her dignity a beacon of possibility, and her voice a clarion call for accountability. Ultimately, Margaret Allen's story affirmed a universal truth. Courage, integrity, and resilience can confront systemic oppression and effect lasting change. The narrative did not merely chronicle individual injustice, it illuminated the broader social, legal, and moral consequences of unchecked authority. It demonstrated that even in the face of fear, intimidation, and physical threat, standing firm in truth and justice could reshape institutions, protect vulnerable populations, and inspire a collective commitment to fairness. The final scene returned to the CVS pharmacy. Margaret, calm and composed, collected Harold's medication. Marcus greeted her with a genuine smile. The staff acknowledged her presence with respect, and the ordinary ritual of filling a prescription became a quiet celebration of dignity restored. Outside, the world had changed. Police quotas were abolished, procedural safeguards strengthened, and multiple officers held accountable. Green served time for civil rights violations. Rodriguez faced consequences for complicity. Systemic oversight mechanisms ensured lasting reform. Margaret Allen's quiet determination had sparked a movement, empowered victims, and restored faith in justice. Her actions were a testament to the enduring power of moral courage, the necessity of accountability, and the profound impact one individual could have on correcting systemic wrongdoing. The story closed on a note of triumph, but the emotional resonance extended far beyond the narrative itself. It left audiences inspired, outraged at injustice, and reassured that courage and integrity can indeed prevail. Harold squeezed her hand, a small but profound affirmation. Margaret looked down at him, her eyes reflecting the struggles endured and the victories earned. Together they had weathered the storm of humiliation, fear, and systemic abuse. Together they had turned pain into progress. And in that quiet domestic scene, against the backdrop of a changed city, Margaret Allen's legacy of dignity, resilience, and justice had taken firm root, ready to guide future generations in the ongoing fight for equality, accountability, and the recognition of every individual's inherent worth. Outro. This isn't just a story about one officer, one arrest, or one brave woman. It's about standing up to injustice, protecting dignity, and proving that no one, no matter their age, race, or station in life, should be powerless in the face of abuse. Elizabeth's courage reminds us that change begins when we refuse to stay silent, and that accountability is possible, even against the most entrenched systems. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on the power of standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to Racist Reality. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story that exposes injustice, celebrates resilience, and shares real-life moments that demand your attention. And don't stop here. Visit Racist Reality to watch more powerful stories that shine a light on courage, challenge systemic bias, and celebrate the human spirit in the face of adversity. Every view, every share, every comment helps amplify these voices and makes a difference. Justice may be delayed, but stories like this ensure it is never denied. Stay engaged, stay aware, and never underestimate the power of one person to change everything.